The cupcake sat untouched. One candle unlit. Chloe Beaumont turned 32 in the corner of Riverside Café, surrounded by laughter she couldn't hear, conversations she couldn't join. Her silk dress cost more than most people's rent, but no amount of money could buy her what she wanted most, to be seen. Then a little girl appeared at her table, hands moving in graceful signs. "Happy birthday!" Behind her stood a man with calloused hands and worn jeans, a single father who lifted his own hands and signed, "Sorry if we're bothering you. My daughter noticed you were alone." For the first time in 28 years of silence, someone had spoken her language without being paid to. In that moment, 3 strangers found something none of them expected. But some connections come with a price, and some secrets, buried for 28 years, have the power to destroy everything they're about to build. Chloe stared at the child, then at the man. Her throat tightened. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7, with curious brown eyes and a backpack decorated with cartoon rabbits. The man looked about 35, his face weathered in a way that spoke of hard work and harder losses. Around them, the cafe buzzed with Friday afternoon energy. Espresso machines hissing, chairs scraping, the murmur of dozens of conversations that existed in a world Chloe had stopped being part of when she was 4 years old. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. Her hands moved almost of their own accord, signing back with a precision that came from years of expensive tutors and lonely practice. "You didn't bother me. Thank you. Both of you." The girl's face lit up like Christmas morning. She bounced on her toes and signed rapidly to her father. "Daddy, she knows sign. She's like me." The man smiled, and it transformed his tired features into something warm and genuine. He pulled out the chair across from Chloe without waiting for permission, a boldness that would have irritated her an hour ago, but now felt like exactly what she needed. "I'm Garrett," he signed, then spoke aloud for the benefit of the cafe around them, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who worked with his hands. "This is my daughter, Piper." The little girl waved enthusiastically, then pointed at the unlit candle on Chloe's cupcake with an expression of pure concern. "You didn't make a wish." Piper signed, her small hands moving with the fluid grace of a native speaker. "Birthday wishes are the most important kind." Chloe felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Garrett caught the waiter's attention and ordered 2 hot chocolates without looking at the menu, the kind of casual confidence that came from a man who knew what his daughter liked and didn't waste time pretending to consider options they couldn't afford anyway. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, counted out bills that looked like they might have been his last, and handed them over with a small smile that said it was worth it. When he turned back to Chloe, his eyes held a question he was too polite to ask directly. She recognized that look, the same one she'd seen in mirrors her whole life, loneliness recognizing loneliness. Piper had already taken matters into her own small hands. She flagged down a waiter and asked, in sign, forcing the confused young man to look at her father for translation, if they had matches. When a small box arrived, she carefully struck one with the intense concentration of a child performing surgery, lit Chloe's candle, and then began to sing Happy Birthday in sign language. Her hands danced through the familiar melody, and after a moment's hesitation, Garrett joined her. Chloe watched their hands move in perfect synchronization, father and daughter, and something inside her that had been holding its breath for 28 years finally exhaled. The song ended. Piper gestured urgently at the candle, which was dripping wax onto the buttercream frosting. "Make a wish! Quick, before it melts!" Chloe closed her eyes, and for the first time since she could remember, she actually wished for something real. Not for hearing. She'd stopped wishing for that decades ago. Not for her father to notice her. That ship had sailed so long ago she couldn't even see the harbor anymore. She wished, simply and desperately, for this moment to be the beginning of something instead of just another ending. When she opened her eyes and blew out the candle, both Garrett and Piper applauded silently, their hands creating a visual celebration that felt more genuine than any sound could have been. They shared the cupcake, breaking it into 3 pieces with their fingers like children at a picnic. Piper chatted away in sign, telling Chloe about her school, her favorite teacher, the rabbit she wanted, but her dad said they couldn't afford yet. Garrett tried to shush her, embarrassed, but Chloe shook her head and smiled. She pulled out a napkin and wrote in elegant script, "I like rabbits too. Maybe someday you'll get one." Piper clutched the napkin like it was a binding contract, her eyes shining with the kind of hope that made Chloe's heart ache with things she didn't want to name. An hour passed like minutes. Garrett told her about his work as a carpenter, how he built custom furniture in a workshop attached to his garage. His wife had died 3 years ago. He signed this simply, matter-of-factly, the way people talk about old wounds that have scarred over but still hurt when it rains. Piper had been born deaf, a genetic lottery that his wife had blamed herself for until her last day, even though Garrett had never once seen it as anything but part of what made his daughter perfect. They'd learned sign language together, the whole family, turning their kitchen into a classroom and their lives into a constant conversation conducted in comfortable silence. Chloe found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. How her father, Vincent Beaumont, was one of Portland's wealthiest real estate developers. How she lived in a mansion that felt like a museum, surrounded by staff who smiled and nodded but never really saw her. How she'd been deaf since she was 4 years old. She didn't explain why, not yet, maybe not ever. And how her father's solution to every problem was money, as if enough zeros on a check could fill the spaces where love should have been. Garrett listened without pity, without the awkward sympathy she'd grown to hate. He just nodded, understanding something fundamental that most people never grasped. Loneliness didn't care about bank accounts. The cafe was emptying now, the late afternoon crowd giving way to the dinner rush that hadn't quite started. Garrett glanced at his phone and winced. "We should go. I have a project due tomorrow and Piper has homework." But Piper was already writing on a napkin, her letters careful and deliberate. "Can we see you again?" She pushed it toward Chloe with an expression so hopeful it was almost painful to witness. Chloe pulled out her phone, the latest model, rose gold, completely untouched by the messy reality of most people's lives, and they exchanged numbers, Garrett's fingers fumbling slightly with his cracked screen as he typed. As they stood to leave, Garrett signed one more thing, his hands moving with a gentleness that made Chloe's breath catch. "You're not alone anymore. If you need a friend, we're here." It was the kind of promise that should have felt empty coming from a stranger, but somehow it didn't. Piper threw her arms around Chloe's waist in an impulsive hug, then bounced away toward the door, her backpack swinging. Garrett followed, pausing at the threshold to look back once. Their eyes met across the cafe, and in that moment, Chloe felt something she couldn't name. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to hope. She sat back down after they left, staring at the napkin with Piper's phone number written in careful digits. The table was scattered with crumbs and empty cups and the small debris of an ordinary afternoon that had somehow become the most extraordinary birthday of her life. She pulled out her own phone to call her driver, then saw the notifications she'd been ignoring. 15 texts from her father's assistant, 3 missed calls, and finally, 1 message from Vincent himself, just 2 words. "Come home." The drive back to the Beaumont estate took 20 minutes through Portland's West Hills, each mile taking her further from the warmth of Riverside Cafe and closer to the cold perfection of the house she'd never managed to think of as home. The gates opened automatically, recognizing the car. The driveway curved through manicured gardens that a team of landscapers maintained, but that Chloe had never once seen her father walk through. The house rose ahead like something from a magazine spread, all glass and steel and architectural ambition, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're designed to impress rather than to shelter. Vincent was waiting in his study, a room that smelled of expensive leather and old money. He stood when she entered, tall and imposing at 58, his silver hair perfectly styled even at 6 in the evening. He didn't sign. He'd never learned, despite 28 years of having a deaf daughter, but pulled out his tablet and typed with swift, efficient fingers. "Where were you? Security said you left without your detail." "That's unacceptable." Chloe felt the familiar weight of his disapproval settle over her shoulders like a coat she'd never asked to wear. She typed back on her own phone, her thumbs moving with practiced speed. "It was my birthday. I wanted to spend it like a normal person." Vincent's expression tightened in that way it did when she disappointed him, which was most of the time, even when she wasn't trying to. "You're not a normal person. You're a Beaumont, and you're vulnerable. Do you understand what could happen to you? People who would take advantage?" His hands moved with sharp, angry gestures, as if the very idea of her independence was a personal insult. Chloe typed back, each word deliberate. "I met some kind people today. A father and his daughter. They were nice to me without wanting anything." Something shifted in Vincent's face, a flicker of something that might have been fear if she hadn't known better. He took the phone from her hands, an old power play that still worked even now, and typed, "What father? What daughter? Who were they?" The questions came rapid fire, and Chloe suddenly felt like she was being interrogated rather than having a conversation with family. She reached for her phone, but Vincent held it just out of reach, waiting. Finally she signed, knowing he wouldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. "People who see me, actually see me." Then she turned and left the study, leaving her father standing there with his tablet and his questions, and his expensive, empty concern. In her room, Chloe lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about calloused hands and a little girl's hopeful smile, and the way Garrett had looked at her like she was a person instead of a problem to be managed. She pulled out her phone and sent a text. "Thank you for today. It meant more than you know." The response came back within minutes. "Thank you for letting us crash your birthday. Piper hasn't stopped talking about you. Well, signing about you." Then after a pause, another message. "Would you want to meet again? Maybe somewhere less crowded?" Chloe typed yes before she could overthink it, then added, "The library? Tomorrow afternoon?" She didn't sleep well that night. When she did drift off, she dreamed of birthday candles that never went out and hands moving through darkness, creating light. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a secret Chloe kept tucked close to her heart. She met Garrett and Piper at the library, where they sat in the children's section, and Piper read picture books aloud in sign language, her small hands creating stories more vivid than any narration could have been. They met at parks where Piper could run and play, while Garrett and Chloe talked about everything and nothing, his memories of his wife Julia, who'd had the same laugh as their daughter, Chloe's memories of a childhood spent in silence, watching her father build an empire while forgetting to build a family. Vincent's security followed her, of course. She spotted the black sedan on the 3rd meeting, parked a discreet distance away. By the 5th meeting, she stopped caring. Let them watch. Let them report back that she was spending time with a carpenter and his 7-year-old daughter. What could they possibly find objectionable about that? But Vincent found plenty objectionable. He cornered her one evening after she returned from Garrett's workshop, a converted garage that smelled of sawdust and wood glue, where she'd spent an afternoon learning to sand a piece of pine smooth, her expensive manicure sacrificed to the simple pleasure of making something with her own hands. Vincent didn't type this time. He thrust a folder at her, and when she opened it, she found photos. Garrett at his workshop. Garrett dropping Piper at school. Garrett's modest house in a neighborhood where the cars were old and the lawns needed mowing. And beneath the photos, a background check as thorough as anything the FBI might run. Garrett Daniel Hayes, 35 years old, widowed, sole custody of one daughter, income barely above the poverty line, father deceased when Garrett was 7 years old. That last detail was highlighted in yellow, and beneath it, a name that made Chloe's blood run cold. Daniel Hayes. She looked up at her father, questions forming, but Vincent was already typing on his tablet, his fingers moving with the controlled fury of someone who'd been waiting for this confrontation. His father worked for me. 28 years ago. There was an accident. He died. The words were simple, brutal, and completely insufficient for the weight they carried. Chloe's hands started to shake as she read the rest of the report. Daniel Hayes had been an architect, a brilliant one, who'd designed Vincent's breakthrough project, the riverside complex that had launched the Beaumont empire into the stratosphere. There had been a dispute over patents and credit. There had been arguments. And then, one rainy night in March of 1997, Daniel Hayes had died in a car accident. Vincent was still typing. The police ruled it an accident, but there were questions. Questions I made sure stayed buried. Questions that could have destroyed everything I was building, including a future for my daughter who would need care for the rest of her life. Chloe felt sick. She set down the folder and signed, knowing he wouldn't understand but needing the expression anyway. What did you do? Vincent just shook his head and typed. I protected our family. I did what was necessary. And now that man's son has entered your life. Do you think that's a coincidence? She wanted to scream that it was, that Garrett didn't even know who she was beyond Chloe, that Piper had just seen a lonely woman and wanted to share a birthday cupcake. But doubt, once planted, grows faster than trust. She locked herself in her room and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the messages she and Garrett had exchanged. She studied every word for signs of manipulation, for hints that he'd known all along. But all she found were casual conversations, dad jokes, photos of Piper's artwork, questions about how her day had been. Nothing calculating, nothing cold, just warmth and genuine interest, and the kind of connection she'd never experienced before. The next day, Chloe did something she'd never done before. She went digging through her father's files. Vincent was at a meeting in Seattle. She'd heard his assistant mention it, and the house was as empty as it ever got, with just the staff pretending not to notice as she slipped into the study she normally avoided. It took her 2 hours to find what she was looking for, buried in a locked cabinet behind framed awards and architectural blueprints. A folder marked Hayes, closed, in her father's precise handwriting. Inside, she found the truth. The police report from March of 1997. Daniel Hayes, vehicle failure, brakes malfunctioned, car went off a cliff on Highway 26 during a rainstorm. But beneath the official report, there were other documents, maintenance records showing the brakes had been recently serviced, a mechanic's statement, never submitted to police, questioning how brakes that new could fail so catastrophically, and a check, written by Vincent Beaumont to that same mechanic, for $50,000 with consulting fee written in the memo line. The date on the check was 2 days after Daniel Hayes died. Chloe's hands trembled as she read further. Letters between Vincent and his lawyers discussing liability and exposure and how to ensure no further investigation. And then, tucked in the very back, a medical file she almost missed. Her own medical records from June of 1997, 3 months after Daniel Hayes died. She'd been 4 years old. The diagnosis: sudden hearing loss, cause unknown, possibly triggered by severe emotional trauma. There was a note from the doctor, speculating about what might have caused such trauma in a young child. And beneath that note, in Vincent's handwriting, "She was in the house when I took the call about the accident. She must have heard me discussing it with Raymond. The stress, my stress, must have affected her." The room spun. Chloe sat down hard in her father's leather chair, the folder spilling across the desk. She'd lost her hearing because her father had killed a man. Not directly, perhaps, but close enough that it made no difference. The stress and fear and guilt that had filled their house in the months after Daniel Hayes died had somehow reached into her 4-year-old body and stolen her hearing away. And Vincent had known, had suspected, had done nothing except throw money at the problem and keep her locked away where no one could ask uncomfortable questions. She took photos of everything with shaking hands, sent them to her own email, then carefully returned the folder to exactly where she'd found it. That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what to do. She could go to Garrett and tell him everything, but what would that accomplish except destroying whatever fragile thing they'd built together? She could go to the police with the evidence she'd found, but would they even care about a 28-year-old accident, even with proof of a cover-up? Or she could do nothing, keep the secret, and try to build a life on a foundation of lies. In the end, the choice was made for her. A week later, Vincent announced he was flying to New York for 3 days of meetings. Chloe waited until his car disappeared down the long driveway, then called Garrett. They met at his workshop, Piper at school, the space filled with the quiet that Chloe had come to love, the kind where she didn't feel like she was missing anything, because the silence itself was the conversation. Garrett was working on a rocking chair, his hands moving over the wood with a reverence that made her think of prayers. She watched him work for a long moment, memorizing the line of his shoulders, the concentration on his face, the way his hands, so different from her father's manicured ones, created beauty from raw materials. Then she pulled out her phone and showed him the photos she'd taken. Garrett read them slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something darker and more painful. When he finished, he set the phone down carefully, like it might explode. His hands moved in sign language, but they shook. "Your father killed my dad?" Chloe signed back, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know when I met you." Garrett stood abruptly, pacing the small workshop, his breathing harsh enough that she could see his chest heaving. He picked up a piece of wood, put it down, picked up another one. For a long moment she thought he might throw something, break something, destroy the careful order of his workspace. Instead, he turned to her and signed, each movement sharp and angry. "How long have you known?" She told him. 1 week. 7 days of carrying this weight alone, trying to figure out what to do with it. "And you came here?" Garrett signed, his hands moving faster now, almost violent in their speed. "You came to tell me that my father died because yours wanted money and power and was willing to do anything to get it. That my whole childhood, growing up without a dad, watching my mom work 3 jobs to keep us fed, having nothing, was because a rich man decided my father's life was worth less than a patent dispute." Chloe nodded, unable to defend the indefensible. Garrett laughed, a sound she could see rather than hear, bitter and broken. "And my daughter loves you. Do you know that? She draws pictures of you. She asks every day when we can see you again." Chloe signed through her tears. "I love her too. I love both of you. That's why I had to tell you. I won't build something real on a foundation of lies." Garrett stared at her for a long moment, and she watched his face cycle through emotions too quick to name. Finally he signed, slowly and deliberately. "I need you to leave. I need to think. I need to—" He broke off, couldn't finish. Chloe nodded, picked up her purse with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, and walked toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back at him one last time. He was standing exactly where she'd left him, his hands braced on the workbench, his head bowed. She wanted to say something, sign something, but there were no words in any language for this kind of goodbye. So she just left, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft click that felt like the end of everything. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Chloe's life. She stayed in her room mostly, declining her father's attempts at conversation through his assistant. She ignored the texts from the security team, asking if she planned to go out. She sat by her window and watched Portland's autumn rain and thought about a little girl who'd shared her birthday and a man who'd taught her what it felt like to be seen. Her phone stayed silent. No text from Garrett, no silly photos from Piper. Nothing but the void of absence, which was somehow worse than the silence she'd lived with her whole life. On the 15th day, her phone buzzed. A text from Garrett. "Can we talk?" Her heart stopped, started again, raced. She typed back immediately. "Yes. When? Where?" His response. "Riverside Café. Tomorrow at 3. Where it started." Chloe stared at the message, trying to read emotion into plain text, trying to figure out if this was goodbye or something else. She typed, "I'll be there," then spent the next 24 hours alternating between hope and despair, unable to settle on either. She arrived at Riverside Café 15 minutes early, ordered a coffee she didn't drink, and sat at the same table where she'd spent her 32nd birthday alone. The afternoon crowd swirled around her, students with laptops, couples sharing desserts, a woman in business attire conducting a hushed phone call. Chloe felt like a ghost haunting her own life, watching the living go about their business while she waited for a verdict she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Garrett arrived exactly at 3, alone. No Piper bouncing through the door, no backpack decorated with cartoon rabbits. Just a man who looked like he'd aged years in 2 weeks, his eyes red-rimmed and tired, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. He sat down across from her without ceremony, and they stared at each other for a long moment before either of them moved. Finally, Garrett pulled out his phone and typed, "I'm still angry. At your father. At the world. At myself for feeling what I feel about you, despite everything." Chloe typed back, "You have every right to be angry. You have every right to hate me." Garrett shook his head and typed, "I don't hate you. That's the problem. I want to. It would be easier. But Piper cries every night. She asks why you stopped visiting. She thinks she did something wrong." The words hit Chloe like physical blows. She typed through tears, "Can I see her? Explain? I don't want her to think—" Garrett interrupted by holding up his hand, then typing more. "That's why I asked you here. I need to know what you're going to do with the information you found." Chloe had thought about this constantly for 2 weeks. She typed slowly, choosing each word with care. "I'm going to the police. Your father deserves justice, even if it's 28 years late. My father needs to face consequences for what he did. I know it will destroy my family, what's left of it. I know I'll lose everything, but it's the right thing to do." She looked up from her phone to find Garrett staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. He typed, "That will ruin your life. Your father will disown you. You'll have nothing." She typed back, "I'll have the truth. And maybe, if you can ever forgive me, I'll have you and Piper." Garrett's hands were shaking as he typed his response. "You'd give up everything. Your money, your house, your whole life. For my father. For us?" Chloe nodded, not trusting herself to type without breaking down completely. Garrett stood abruptly, and for a moment she thought he was leaving. Instead, he moved around the table and sat in the chair next to her. He pulled a small wooden box from his jacket pocket and set it on the table between them. "Open it," he said aloud, the first words he'd spoken rather than typed or signed since he'd arrived. Chloe's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, cushioned on a piece of felt, was a ring carved from wood. Simple, elegant, beautiful in the way that handmade things are beautiful. She looked up at Garrett in confusion. He signed, his hands moving slowly and deliberately. "I made it 3 weeks ago, before I knew. I was going to ask you, not to marry me, not yet, but to promise that we'd try, that we'd see where this could go." Chloe felt like she couldn't breathe. Garrett continued signing. "My dad used to say that good men build things, homes, furniture, relationships. They don't destroy out of anger or bitterness. They build something better from the rubble." He picked up the ring, held it to the light where the grain of the wood caught the afternoon sun. "I can't promise I'm ready to forgive. I can't promise this will be easy. But if you're willing to do what's right, even when it costs you everything, then you're the kind of person my dad would have wanted me to know. The kind of person I want Piper to know." He slid the ring across the table toward her, not onto her finger. They weren't there yet, might never be, but close enough that she could touch it, feel the smoothness of the wood he'd shaped with his own hands. Chloe looked at the ring, then at Garrett, then back at the ring. She signed, "What are you saying?" Garrett signed back, "I'm saying let's take it one day at a time. Let's do the right thing together and see what's left standing when the dust settles. Let's show Piper that people can be brave and honest and choose each other even when it's hard." Chloe picked up the ring, held it in her palm, felt its weight. Barely anything at all, but somehow more significant than any piece of jewelry she'd ever owned. She signed, "I'm scared." Garrett signed back, "Me too. But I think maybe brave people are just scared people who do the right thing anyway." They sat there in Riverside Café as the afternoon turned to evening, hands finding hands across the table, talking in sign and texts and the comfortable silence that had become their native language. When they finally left, Garrett walked her to her car, and before she got in, he signed one more thing. "Piper wants to know if you can come to dinner tomorrow. I told her I'd ask." Chloe signed back, "I'd love that more than anything." She drove home through Portland's evening traffic, the wooden ring on the passenger seat beside her, thinking about justice and consequences and the strange way that the people who save you can be connected to the ones who broke you. But maybe, she thought, that's what redemption looks like. Not erasing the past, but building something new from its broken pieces. The next morning, Chloe walked into a law office downtown and told them everything. She handed over the documents, the photos, the evidence of a crime 28 years old but no less real for the passage of time. The lawyers listened with increasing disbelief, took notes, promised to investigate. It would be a long process, they warned. The statute of limitations on some charges might have expired, but wrongful death, obstruction of justice, bribing witnesses, those cases could still be made. They'd be in touch. That evening, Chloe went to Garrett's house for the first time. It was small, maybe a quarter the size of her bathroom at the estate, but it was filled with light and life and evidence of people who actually lived there. Piper's drawings on the refrigerator, Garrett's tools organized neatly in the corner, a couch that had been sat on so much it had a permanent indent. Piper threw herself at Chloe the moment she walked in, signing so fast her hands blurred. "I missed you, I missed you, I missed you. Where were you? Why didn't you visit? Did I do something wrong?" Chloe knelt down to Piper's level and signed carefully. "You did nothing wrong. I had to handle some grown-up problems. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." They ate spaghetti that Garrett had made from scratch, the sauce rich and perfect in the way that food tastes when it's made by someone who cares. After dinner, Piper insisted on showing Chloe every drawing she'd made in the past 2 weeks, and half of them were of the three of them together, always holding hands, always smiling. As Chloe looked at those pictures, she felt something shift inside her chest, like a door she'd kept locked for 28 years finally swinging open. Over the next 6 months, Chloe's life fell apart and came back together in ways she'd never imagined. The police investigation went public. Vincent was questioned, then formally charged with obstruction of justice and being an accessory to manslaughter. The mechanic, faced with his own legal jeopardy, had finally talked, confirming what the documents suggested. The Beaumont empire shuddered. Vincent's lawyers fought back with every weapon money could buy. But Chloe's testimony, the daughter who'd found the evidence and brought it forward, was devastating to his defense. Vincent disowned her, exactly as she'd predicted. She moved out of the estate with nothing but her clothes and her car, which she promptly sold because she couldn't afford the insurance. She found a small apartment in a neighborhood where the buildings were old and the neighbors knew each other's names. She got a job at the Deaf Community Center, teaching sign language to parents who'd just learned their children would grow up in silence and needed to know that silence wasn't emptiness. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries, and she'd never been happier in her life. Garrett and Piper were there for all of it. Through the media circus, when the story broke, Billionaire's daughter exposes father's deadly secret, and the harassment from people who thought she was a traitor to her family. Through the day the charges were formally filed, and the day Vincent refused to see her when she tried to visit him in custody. Through the night, she broke down crying because she'd given up everything she'd ever known, and sometimes wondered if it was worth it. Garrett held her while she cried and signed. "It's worth it, you're worth it, and you're not alone." The trial took 9 months. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, Vincent Beaumont was convicted of obstruction of justice and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Not enough, by Chloe's estimation, but more than she'd secretly feared he might get. The judge also ordered him to pay restitution to Garrett. Not enough to make up for a lost father, but enough to secure Piper's college fund and let Garrett finally open the furniture shop he'd been dreaming about since Julia died. The shop would be called Hayes and Beaumont Woodworks, a partnership between a carpenter and a woman learning to build things with her hands for the first time in her life. 1 year after that birthday in Riverside Café, Chloe found herself back at the same table, wearing a simple dress from a thrift store that had cost $15 and fit her better than anything she'd owned in her old life. Garrett and Piper sat across from her, and on the table between them was a cupcake with a single candle. Piper signed with theatrical flair. "Make a wish, and this time we'll know it came true because we're here." Chloe closed her eyes and thought about wishes and how sometimes they come true in ways you never expect. She'd wished to be seen, and now she was. Not as a Beaumont or a victim or a deaf woman who needed special accommodation. Just as Chloe, a person who'd found her family in the wreckage of someone else's crimes and had chosen to build something new from the broken pieces. She opened her eyes, blew out the candle, and signed to the 2 people who'd saved her life by letting her save theirs. "I love you both more than I can say." Piper signed back. "We love you too. Can we have cake now?" And Garrett, laughing silently, signed, "Always, kiddo, always." Outside Riverside Café, Portland's autumn afternoon faded into evening, and 3 people who'd started as strangers carved out a space where silence was full of meaning, and family was something you chose rather than something you were born into. The wooden ring sat on Chloe's finger now, not quite an engagement ring, but not one either. A promise of someday and maybe, and we'll figure it out together. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.